Hello, everyone. Today I just wanted to go over the 4 in-car adjustments that you can make in a Dallara IR18 IndyCar on iRacing. So those 4 adjustments are Weightjacker, front anti-roll bar, rear anti-roll bar, and brake bias. The first one I'll cover is Weightjacker. So Weightjacker, if you don't know, has an adjustment range from -20 to +20, but every fixed setup has it start at 0, which is the middle point. Weightjacker, in the simplest terms, more positive Weightjacker will make the car looser, more negative Weightjacker will make it tighter. But let's dive into sort of the mechanisms of how that works. So, the primary thing that Weightjacker adjusts is the cross weight of the car. So, what what is cross weight? Cross weight is the difference in weight distribution between the right front, left rear diagonal of the car and the left front, right rear diagonal of the car. To kind of simplify things, basically, Weightjacker is adjusting how much weight is on the right front compared to the right rear, is the easiest way to think about it, in my opinion. So, right now, the base setup on 0 Weightjacker, as you can see, Weightjacker's down here, 0. It says we have minus 210 pounds on the left front, which means that this diagonal has less weight on it than the other diagonal. So that means we have more weight on the right front because this value is negative. If this value is positive, it would mean we have less weight on the right front, more on the right rear. So first of all, what happens when you have more weight like this on the right front? Well, typically, as you shift more weight on the right front is going to be more easily overloaded, um, which means that the car is going to typically understeer because the front's giving out first. It also means that you're going to have more load on the right front because there's more weight on it. And that means that you're going to have more heat buildup in the right front, and it typically means you're going to have more right front wear and going to develop understeer as the run goes. The opposite's true if you had the more weight you put on the right rear, the more oversteer the car gets, because the right rear will give out sooner. Um, and likewise, you'll build up more heat in the right rear as the run goes on, which means that the car will be more prone to oversteer. Um, Obviously, there's a middle ground in there where you have relatively even tire wear, but it's all, dependent on what the rest of the setup is as to what crossweight will be that middle ground. 0 crossweight is not necessarily the middle ground between having even wear on the right sides. It completely depends on the spring rates and ride heights and just the rest of the setup. But so just as an example, so if I go positive on Weightjacker, so I'm up to +5 now, you can see I'm at minus 170 on crossweight. And if I take it back down, you'll see this weight on the right front increases when I go back to 0. So that means when I go to +5, I'm taking weight off the right front, adding weight to the right rear, and the opposite is basically these diagonals are attached to each other on the car, so you can see the interaction with the corners. And the opposite happens when I go down on Weightjacker. So when I go negative Weightjacker, I get more negative cross weight, and so I get more weight on the right front and less on the right rear. So that's the primary effect. The other big effect that Weightjacker has on the car is it affects rear ride height. And this is because the way the Weightjacker works is it's a hydraulic piston on the right rear corner of the car. And basically, when you're adding positive Weightjacker, it's extending and pushing the rear of the car up, specifically the right rear, but indirectly it makes the whole rear of the car go up. And when you compress it, the rear of the car goes down. So not only does this affect the cross weight, like we discussed, it also affects the aero balance. So the higher the rear of the car goes, so the more positive Weightjacker, you'll have a more positive aero balance. And what I mean by that is the car will also get more oversteer from aero. The opposite is true. When you go down on Weightjacker, you'll also get some understeer from aero. And you can see this ride height influence as well. So when I go to +5, the rear ride height went up. And when I go to negative, the rear ride height goes down. The front ride height does change slightly, but it's a lot less than the rear. The other thing you're doing is typically on most oval setups in the community, the front is lower than the rear, just in general. So then when you raise the rear, you're putting the car in a more positive rake position, meaning that there's a greater difference between the front and the rear ride heights. This means that also the car is a little bit more unstable mechanically as well. And the main place you feel this is in transitions. So, for example, on the ovals, the main transitions are getting into the banking and coming off the banking. And more negative Weightjacker will make it more stable in those situations. So, and that's partly a mechanical thing due to rake, and it's also partially an aero stability thing, like I kind of mentioned. So basically, more positive Weightjacker will make the car looser due to putting more weight on the right rear, less on the right front. Then it also slightly shifts the aero balance forward. It would be like adding front wing in terms of what it does for balance, not necessarily what it does for downforce. And then it also just makes the car a little bit more unstable from a rake perspective. The other caveat I'll add on to that is that on the ride height side of things, which this, I'll leave up to you guys to investigate more. But for this car, there's optimal ride heights for the car on ovals. And in a previous video I've done, which I'll link in the description, I covered the aero calculator, which is here on the tires aero page, and basically how it works. And so if you look at data, log data, you can figure out what your ride heights are and figure out if they're in the optimal window or for rear ride height. But basically the long and short of it is, if you go too high on rear ride height, you can go put yourself outside of the optimal downforce window, and then you'll just be losing downforce. Likewise, you can also go too low and do the same thing. And another thing I would caution you on is a lot of setups, if you go too far negative, you can start to ground the rear. So if you ever feel that the car gets looser because you go negative Weightjacker, there's a chance it could be grounding. And I'd encourage you to check the log data, just in case. So that's kind of a brief overview of how the Weightjacker works. The roll bars are a bit different. So you have a front roll bar, which has positions 1 to 6, and a rear roll bar that has the same. So the first thing is not every setup has roll bars. So this Kansas setup does. It has bar diameter large on the front and on the rear. Some setups, if they have none selected here, then that means regardless of what your blade position is, it means that you have no ARB on the rear, so all the positions would be the same because you're not adjusting anything. And the other thing is that the larger the bar is, so a large bar, every adjustment position will have a bigger effect than on a small bar because the total stiffness is greater. All right, but what do they do in the first place? So on the front bar, basically, so it has, like I said, it has positions 1 through 6. 6 is the stiffest setting, 1 is the softest setting. So with a stiffer front roll bar, you are going to get more understeer mid-corner in general, but you're also going to have a more responsive front of the car. So basically what happens is An anti-roll bar does exactly what it says. It resists roll of that into the car. So when you go to a stiffer front bar, because the car rolls less, it takes a set. So it reaches, it stops rolling and reaches kind of its steady state position faster because it doesn't have as far to go because it's not going to roll as far. That means that because it doesn't have to go as far, you feel it responding faster because it gets to its set position faster. So that's why a stiffer roll bar will be more responsive. But um, it's like increasing your front spring rates. Basically, you have less mechanical compliance, like in general. So that means that you're going to have more, the front is more easily overloaded. So you'll generally have more understeer, especially, like I said, um, when you're leaning on the front. And on an oval, or just in general, you normally lean on the front more in the first third of the corner and also in the middle of the corner than you do the rear. So the front roll bar will be slightly more powerful in the beginning of the corner. The rear roll bar is kind of is a similar thing, but on the rear. So um, a stiffer rear roll bar is going to make the rear more responsive, and it's also going to mean that the rear can be more easily overloaded. So that means you can have more oversteer mid corner with a stiffer rear bar. Um, the rear bar is typically more it affects the car both in the middle of the corner, like the front roll anti-roll bar, but it also affects the car more on exit, um, because that's when you're on throttle and you're like really leaning on the rear of the car more than the front. So basically, if I was to summarize, I would say the front anti-roll bar, if you stiffen it, it makes the front more responsive but more understeery mid corner and the first third of the corner. And the rear anti-roll bar, if you stiffen it, it'll make the rear of the car more responsive and it'll make it more oversteery both in the middle and like second half of the corner. But both of them have an impact on the whole corner slightly. I'm just saying where the characteristics are biased towards. The other thing that you have to be careful with on uh, roll bars is, or not really careful with, but just be cognizant of. Different setups will have different ARB preloads. It's not super important what ARB preload does right now, but basically the thing to know is when you change your anti-roll bar position, your ARB preload will also change. This means that your crossweight will also change slightly. So in this case, because we have positive front ARB preload, when I go on to a softer front bar, I'm actually uh, decreasing right front weight, so I'm going more positive on cross weight. So not only am I getting the impact of the front bar making the car looser, I'm also getting a slight cross weight adjustment when I do that. The same is true with the rear bar. When I stiffen it, in this case, I'm also taking some weight off the right front. Not all setups have positive ARB preload or negative in the rear. Some of them have it the opposite way. So it's possible that softening the front bar could put more weight on the right front. So it can go either way, but obviously, whichever way the crossweight goes, it'll slightly impact the handling characteristics of what happens when you change the roll bar as well. So just something to be aware of. Um, in terms of how to attack making the adjustments in fixed setup, the thing I would say is to try both options between roll bar or all options between roll bar and Weightjacker just to understand what they do. Try them independently. So if a setup has a front bar and rear bar like this one and Weightjacker, first of all, the best place to try it is in traffic, because in traffic, all the handling characteristics of the car are exaggerated. And so ideally, you would get in traffic in a practice session. But you can also try it on your own, but you'll just feel the car more in traffic. In general, I would say, and so I would try just going up on Weightjacker quite a bit, down on Weightjacker quite a bit, and normally a big adjustment on Weightjacker is 5 clicks. Normally in a race, once you get into a region you like, you're only changing it by a few clicks over the course of a run, unless the setup has really weird handling characteristics, which isn't uncommon in fixed. But so I would start off just playing with Weightjacker and seeing what that does. Then going to like front roll bar, resetting the Weightjacker, try the front roll bar, reset it, try the rear roll bar. And every setup will have different things that work. So some setups will respond better to Weightjacker changes. Other setups will respond better to front roll bar changes or rear roll bar changes. And or maybe it's a combination of them that will work. For example, like let's say the setup is tight in the center of the corner, but then loose on exit over the banking transition. Like as the banking falls off, especially a lot of the 1.5 mile ovals have an aggressive banking transition, like Texas and Atlanta come to mind off of turn 2. So a strategy there could be, for example, to soften the front bar to try to help your mid corner rotation, or alternatively stiffen the rear bar to do the same thing, just depends on the setup. And then go more negative on the Weightjacker. So go tighter on the Weightjacker to lower the rear of the car and put a little bit more negative crossweight in just to stabilize the exit of the corner. Because like I was saying, the rear of the car, because you're basically doing, that aero change and a crossweight change there. So just from experience, that would be a way to kind of fix that situation. One other thing I want to note here is that while the tools, the Weightjacker and anti-roll bars, can be used to improve the handling of the car, the most important thing that affects the handling of the car is your driving style. So if you're burning off the right front at let's say you're at Kansas and you're burning off the right front in traffic, you can add positive Weightjacker, or you can, soften the front roll bar or stiffen the rear roll bar to try to help with that. But the number one way to burn the right front off less is to carry less speed on entry. Basically, don't overdrive the entry and push, and focus on getting like good rotation on exits. Basically, lift earlier and don't scrub the tire as much, or find clean air on the track. Whether it's changing lines from the car ahead of you to get more clean air on the nose to make the car understeer less. So basically what I'm trying to say is, while the in-car adjustments are powerful, like they're never going to overpower bad driving techniques. All right, so I covered those 3. There's also one other adjustment, like I was saying, brake bias. On ovals, it's not really that important. It's basically only used for pit in. But the more the higher you go on this number, the more front braking you'll get relative to rear braking, and the smaller you go, it'll add more rear brake. So basically, what you want to do is, the goal is to try to, when you over brake and you lock up the tires, ideally you want all 4 tires to lock up pretty close to each other. So if you're getting a lot of front locking, you want to move the brake bias rearward, so smaller number. If you're getting a lot of rear locking and spinning on pit in, then I would recommend going forward on brake bias to try to lock the fronts. Typically, there's a couple things to note here. One, it's good to practice pit in on old tires and set your brake bias for that, because old tires will have a different impact and a different braking feel than new tires. The other side of this is, typically it's good to err on the side of having slightly more front locking than rear locking, because front locking is a stable condition. You're just going to slide in the direction that you're going. And sure, you're going to have reduced stopping power, but at least you're not going to spin. If you lock a rear tire, you're going to spin and bad things are going to happen. So while you don't want too much front locking because it costs you performance in terms of braking, I would always err towards having more front locking than rear. Yeah, and that's really about it. Let me know if you have any questions on in-car adjustments for fixed setups for the IndyCar and iRacing. Feel free to reach out if you have any other questions related to the IndyCar. And yeah, let me know what you thought of the video. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one.